There you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News. Hi there, very good morning to you. I'm Colin Brazier with you until 2 p.m. today. In the next hour, we'll be looking at England's lateral flow shortage. Millions struggling, it seems, to access COVID tests before New Year's Eve. Plus, with Omicron cases and hospital admissions at least modestly on the rise, 8 temporary Nightingale hospitals have been set up across England. Is it enough to avoid extra COVID curves? All that's coming up. But first, the news with Olivia.
Thank you. This is your news at 11 o'clock. Ghislaine Maxwell's family have launched an appeal after the British socialite was found guilty of helping Jeffrey Epstein sexually abuse girls. The 60-year-old has been convicted of 5 out of 6 charges in the US after a 3-week trial. Jurors found she lured young girls to be abused by Epstein between 1994 and 2004. Maxwell's sentencing date is yet to be confirmed, but it's thought she could spend the rest of her life in prison. The NHS is due to set up Nightingale Hospital surge hubs in England to prepare for increasing cases of Omicron. Work on 8 hubs, holding up to 100 patients each, will start this week. The NHS is also ramping up the use of virtual wards at home, where patients get monitoring technology and regular check-ins with clinicians. Meanwhile, leading scientist Professor Peter Openshaw says a shortage of COVID tests is very worrying. On the same day that the UK reported more than 183,000 lab-confirmed cases, a new record, no PCR or lateral flow tests were available to order online. Professor Openshaw, who sits on the New and Emerging Respiratory Virus Threats Advisory Group, is concerned the shortage could lead to people mixing at New Year's without being able to test first. Officials are blaming exceptional demand and global supply issues for the problem. Well, nurses who are exhausted and overwhelmed by the pandemic are regularly working 12-hour shifts to keep the NHS afloat. A Royal College of Nursing survey of 9,000 staff has found that 74% regularly work beyond their shifts, mostly unpaid. The poll was carried out in October before Omicron hit. Many are unhappy with the quality of care they can provide due to inadequate staffing, and 60% are thinking of quitting. Joyce Pinfield, the vice chairman of the National Care Association, says the workforce are struggling.
We are totally exhausted, totally overwhelmed by the amount of work that we are doing. A lot of it is because of the shortage of workforce. NHS has a tremendous shortage of workforce, as does social care. So to try and have all of these extra burdens that have been put on by the pandemic, it's just unsustainable.
From January, insurers will no longer be able to charge existing customers more to renew than they would new customers. It follows a review by the Financial Conduct Authority that found many insurers were increasing prices for renewing customers in a practice known as price walking. It's expected to save consumers £4.2 billion over the next 10 years. Campaigners are warning major changes to the highway code, which put more responsibility on drivers to look out for cyclists and pedestrians, are not being promoted enough. Charity Cycling UK says the changes, which come into force next month, need a long-term and well-funded campaign to make people aware of the updates. The new measures will introduce a risk-based hierarchy of road users. The independent reviewer of terrorism legislation warns mistakes will be made as the parole board considers the release of 92 convicted terrorists. Emergency laws introduced last year blocked their automatic release after 2 attacks were committed by freed extremists. All convicted terrorists must now serve 2/3 of their sentence before being reviewed by a panel. But Jonathan Hall QC fears some of those released may still go on to reoffend. The average UK house price is now 16% higher than before the pandemic. The typical price of a home reached a record high of almost £255,000 in December. That's an increase of just under £24,000 in a year. The Nationwide Building Society says it's the biggest increase ever recorded in a single year. Wales saw the greatest increase, with house prices up on average by 15.8%. That's your news update. I'll be back in an hour with the latest headlines. Now back to Colin.
So it's a huge story, one we've been reflecting this morning and reflecting on this morning. Ghislaine Maxwell then found guilty of recruiting and trafficking young girls for sexual abuse by, for and with her former partner, the late Jeffrey Epstein. It's believed the British socialite could very well spend the rest of her life now behind bars. Lisa Bloom, who represented 8 of Epstein's alleged victims, said she was, as she put it, beyond thrilled at the verdict and hoped that Maxwell would never walk free again. This is what she had to say earlier.
Hard to put into words. I mean, imagine the most humiliating, awful experiences of your life and then having to go in front of a room full of strangers after having to talk to law enforcement and prosecutors and lawyers about over and over and over. And then you have to go in and testify. And then you have to be subjected to cross-examination. And well, you said it a little bit differently 2 years ago, and now you're saying it this way. Well, you had a drug addiction problem. Well, you had a sexual issue, over and over again, just these brutal, painful questions, but they endured it. They were very brave. And I want everybody out there to know, because I represent many victims of sexual abuse now against high-profile predators, that you do not have to be perfect. You can have made mistakes in your life, as we all have. You can even have told the story differently in the past before you were ready to tell the full version later. It's okay. You can still be believed. And these 4 women were believed. And now Ghislaine Maxwell is a convicted sex trafficker facing the rest of her life probably in prison because of the courage, the tremendous courage of these 4 women, and also the hard work of the police and the prosecutors and the attorneys who brought this case to justice.
Well, Gloria Allred is an attorney who also represented some of Maxwell's accusers and spoke to Simon and Isabel this morning about why this particular verdict seemingly took quite so long to reach.
We want juries to really get all of their questions answered wherever possible. We want them to have the opportunity to review the evidence carefully if they think they need to do so. And they did that in this case. They asked for the transcripts, the testimony of all 4 accusers, the victims who testified under oath in this case. They also asked to review the transcript of the testimony of some of the defense witnesses. So they were very, very careful. They asked more questions than juries usually do in a case, but that's fine. They took many, many hours and many days. But ultimately, they reached a consensus and they convicted her on most of the charges. And that's really important. And their decision, their conviction, means it does send a message not only to Ms. Maxwell, who is convicted of conspiring to sex traffic underage girls, to Mr. Epstein, the sexual predator, but it sends a message also to other sexual predators and to those who would assist them in sex trafficking, that you may face similar charges one day in a court of law in the United States. You may be convicted and you may face the rest of your life in prison, as may be the case now with Ms. Maxwell.
Gloria, it was interesting to see you smiling when we introduced you this morning. I don't think I've seen you smiling when we've spoken to you before. And I'm just wondering, I bet some of those that you represented will have smiles on their faces and will feel that justice of sorts has been done with this.
Absolutely, because this has been going on for so long. And I mean, it's just the case even against Ms. Maxwell, let alone Jeffrey Epstein, who, of course, either committed suicide or was murdered, not clear which, while he was in detention in the custody at the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York, awaiting trial on his criminal charges. But, you know, some of my clients, you know, spoke to the prosecutors years ago. I mean, this has been going on for a long time, this criminal investigation. So they were denied access. They were denied the ability to confront Jeffrey Epstein in a court of law, as many of them hoped that they'd be able to do and have the truth come out in that trial. But they have some justice now with Ms. Maxwell because so much evidence has come out that was never known before. And I'm talking about evidence, not just allegations, but evidence that was admitted in this court of law. And it's convinced, it's persuaded this very thoughtful jury. And of course, Ms. Maxwell will be appealing, as her defense lawyers said that they would, which is totally expected. And we'll have to see what happens. But I think the prosecution put on a very, very substantial case.
That's the attorney, Gloria Allred, speaking earlier to Simon and Isabel. More of that story throughout the course of the day, in fact. On to other matters now, though. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, urging Britons, at least a little bit, to temper their New Year's Eve celebrations tomorrow, encouraging us to get tested before we leave our homes. However, that is perhaps easier in theory than practice. There is a global shortage in lateral flow tests, and it's become difficult in some parts of the UK to get hold of them. Undermined also this by a shortage of lateral flow and PCR tests across the country. Meanwhile, although a massive rise in hospitalisations from Omicron hasn't materialised, the NHS in England is setting up 8 new Nightingale facilities. Remember them? They will treat patients in the latter stages of recovery from COVID, set up in ancillary spaces, gyms, education centres, even potentially car parks. It's hoped they may not be needed on any scale, but if they are, nursing leaders actually warning they might not necessarily have all the staff they need to run them. Thousands of nursing staff are self-isolating under COVID rules that require them to quarantine for 7 days, that's in England, if they come into close contact with someone with the coronavirus. Well, joining us now, Dr. Catherine Millington-Sanders, who is an NHS doctor and educationalist. Doctor, appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed. On lateral flow tests, we know people are struggling to get hold of them. It's a great pity because actually it does put a little bit of agency back into the hands of individuals, allows them to make some decisions about how they go about their business.
Absolutely. Thank you and good morning. I completely agree. We've had this fantastic messaging of have your lateral flow tests, and then you've got that much more level of control of understanding whether you can go out and you can run your normal business, see your family, engage in normal sort of human interactions. But without that, it does leave us much more vulnerable. And obviously, if people, we know that a third of people can be without symptoms. And so these checking mechanisms are really crucial to be able to help us understand what we can do and when we can do it. So having these shortages, and obviously there are exceptional demand. We've seen a massive rise in people responding to the guidance to make sure that we have lateral flow tests before we do things. And obviously coming out of isolation, day 6 and day 7, there's increased demand, matched by these global supply issues. So it's very difficult, particularly over the holiday periods. People want to make sure that they're even more safe, see their loved ones, and feel that they're safe to see their loved ones. So it's a really difficult issue at the moment.
It's a really difficult issue, but it's also a measure, isn't it, Doctor, of how far we've moved as a society. I mean, if you imagine 18 months ago, the idea that literally tens of millions of people would be to some degree self-diagnosing using these kits, simple though they are, and that demand would be where it is now, you would have found it unconscionable. You wouldn't have thought it possible.
Well, I remember really in the early months of people starting to talk about maybe we can have tests that can tell us if we might be positive. And you're completely right, Colin. Look where we are now, of being able to, in a very short period of time, having a really quite specific test to say, yes, if you're without symptoms, then actually you still may be positive. And it's incredible of where we've come from, yes.
Can I talk a little bit about these Nightingale hospitals? I mean, I was a little bit surprised this morning, turning on the radio quite early, to hear that we were having the surge capacity. I'm not sure NHS England are necessarily invoking that idea of the Nightingale hospital again, but it's obviously a prudent measure. The hospitalisations that we were perhaps braced for on a really big scale haven't come through yet. Maybe they never will. But they're adopting the precautionary principle, making sure they've got this extra capacity. But it's one thing to have the beds in place. It might be another to have nurses to staff them.
Well, I mean, NHS England data shows that 9,500 people are in hospital, so that's a rise of 38% from last week, and that's the highest since March. I mean, it's really prudent. So this time we do have the benefit of being able to look back and be able to plan and have more time to plan. So on one hand, it's incredibly important that we have that planning mechanism for space, as you said, to be able to care for people that we might need extra sort of capacity. But you're completely right. I mean, we've known since, there was the interim NHS People Plan in 2019 that highlighted incredible shortages, not just of nurses, but, doctors, paramedics, mental health workers across the board. But the crucial part, even in 2019, and for many years actually, is this critical nursing shortages. And I mean, it's horrific to actually look at the statistics of these 9,000 people, nurses that were polled, and the real sort of shortages from their perspective, but also they're suffering from stress. Many of them, over a third, have not been able to have actually their full holiday. I, for one, have actually been in on my holiday, was supposed to be having some holiday, but actually there have been shortages in the hospital, so I'm helping hospital staff alongside that. So it's really important to recognise that not only because the level of people that are coming into hospital and are sick in the community, we're having to raise the ante to be there, but also people are off sick. So there are so many more people that are either having to isolate or are actually unwell. And remembering that one person gets ill in a team, actually that can knock out an entire team overnight or within a couple of days. So these pressures are really incredibly important for us to plan for. And we need long-term investment, long-term planning procedures to be able to support patients and the public that we want to serve and look after.
Catherine Millington-Sanders. Doctor, thanks so much for your time. Thanks a lot. Join me again, midday. We'll be talking with quite an important guest, actually, somebody involved in the story of George Bush's apparent confession that he knew very little about international affairs. Also, Gordon Brown's been striking out with some comments that the West is, as he put it, sleepwalking into humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan. But now, Farage, the best of Talking Pints after the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.